Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are around the globe. We're happy to kick off the spring semester series of the International Macro History Online Seminar Series. And we're really honored and glad to have with us Joel Mokyr from Northwestern University, an author of many books in economic history. I'll name just a few and let Joel talk about the more recent ones. So it's The Gifts of Athena, The Enlightened Economy, The Industrial Revolution, the British Industrial Revolution, The Culture of Growth, and many others. So without further ado, I invite Joel to present his recent research on the benefits and costs of diversity. Let me remind the audience that we have the presentation will go for 40 minutes uninterrupted, unless there's some urgent clarifying questions. Then we will proceed to a 20-minute Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A button, not the chat. Please use the Q&A button. We formally end on the hour, and then have another 15 minutes of informal discussion with Joel.
Then we will proceed to a 20. Is a this was sort of inspired a little bit by sort of the experience that people have in universities, which is there's a great deal of talk about diversity, which is seen as a desirable objective, and there's sort of two sources of support for that. One is based on ethics, basically saying, look, low diversity in some way is the result of things that happened in the past that were not right, colonialism, racism, and so on, and these have led to systematic discrimination, and so fairness demands that we be addressed. The other argument made for diversity is that low diversity is inefficient and or sort of impedes economic growth. And so diversity improves economic performance in some way. And I think most economists are surely going to be interested in the efficiency argument, although I should point out that people like Deirdre claim that we are ignoring ethics at our peril. And so what I'm going to try to do today, time allowing, is just to lay out the issues a little bit better and try to define the terms in sort of the concepts of the new institutional economics, then briefly describe some of the most interesting work done by economists, and then hopefully there'll be time to talk about economic history, what we can learn from economic history. So to start off, you can ask diversity of what? So I made a list here. There are sort of 7 things that came to mind. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can see them. And they're sort of obvious: linguistic, religious, genetic, and so on and so forth. And basically just point out there's sort of 2 classes of traits. There are those that are hardwired at birth. There are genetic, phenotypical, ethnic origin, things that you can't change. And others are choice variables. So cultural beliefs, preferences, religion, and things like that. So there's 3 fundamental concepts that I want to define with some care, because they're going to be pivotal to the story, is the difference between what I call diversity, tolerance, and pluralism. And so here is the sort of summary of this. Diversity is about outcomes. So you ask yourself, how are different subpopulations with different traits represented across the economy, socioeconomic status, so access to education, quality housing, healthcare, and such. Okay, so this is just about outcomes. Tolerance is about preferences. So if you want, you can call it culture, but it's about basically preferences, values, beliefs, and things like that. So it basically tries to capture how do people feel about others who are not like them in one or more dimension. And pluralism, and this is my own definition, is about institutions. So institutions in the Doug North sense, in which what are the rules, meaning laws and customs and conventions and so on, that govern how different groups are being treated. So now, why is it that diversity is thought to be efficient? Well, there's sort of static gains and dynamic gains. The static gains basically are sort of obvious to anybody who's taken a course in economics. There are advantages of complementarities between groups, and therefore it supports some kind of division of both labor and knowledge between individuals. And finally, of course, diversity if it can be done, it would facilitate gains from trade between groups that have different if we remove barriers and reduce intergroup transactions cost. The dynamic games are about technological progress and creativity. So this wide belief is that more diverse societies are more creative because they can draw from a larger, sort of what you might call a cultural gene pool or a meme pool, if you're so inclined to use that terminology. So the standard warning that is made in this literature is that these kind of complementarities between groups will increase static and dynamic efficiency if and only if the relationship between the groups are peaceful and subject to rules which I then have called pluralism. Now, the idea that the economic benefit of diversity is not a new idea. Here's a quote from Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and they basically said that diversity among creatures was necessary so that divine goodness might be more perfectly be bestowed on things, and there should be diversity among them, so that what could not be perfectly represented by one single thing may be easier, maybe more perfectly represented in various ways by things of various kinds. So this is obviously an idea that goes back a long time. In more modern economics, I think people have stressed the importance of recombination. So there's a classic paper by Martin Weitzman, published now 25 years ago, in which he basically models how recombination of existing ideas creates a very rapid growth of new ideas if each idea is a combination of two existing ideas. So the larger the reservoir you start with, the faster this happens. So to come back for a second to pluralism, as I said, it's about the institutions, and these institutions are supposed to support peaceful coexistence. In some sense, if you want an example, something of the pluribus unum, the groups of different qualities form a cooperative equilibrium and a single unit for specific purposes, while retaining, of course, their different traits. And so these institutions would be essentially, as long as cooperation and peaceful diversity is maintained, they'd be Pareto improving, in the sense that if there's an absence of state religion, if you can have multiple official languages, colorblind institutions, and so on. And so of course, what it means, and this is, not a trivial thing, is that pluralism permits behavior that may be abhorrent to some, but allowed by these pluralistic institutions, as long as they are victimless, so they do not create any externalities. Okay. Now, tolerance, as I said, measures preferences. And so how much do we care about what others look like, the language they speak, and so on? Now, sort of in a perfect world, perfect tolerance would mean that we are completely indifferent, doesn't appear in our utility function, and we don't care what they believe, as long as people don't act on these beliefs, and so that it measures some kind of a willingness to let 100 flowers bloom, if you want. Now, it's important to point out that such an ideal tolerance is completely unrealistic, because as in biologists and psychologists have known for a long time, we have been hardwired by evolution for what we known as homophily. Here's a classic paper about this, but and one expert, this is Nick Christakis, who wrote recently that the evolution of cooperation requires outgroup hatred, which is really sad, which is, I think, a reflection of this thing, which is we tend to like people who are like us more than people who are not like us. That sort of seems to be hardwired, and this has been observed in animals as well. Now, argument would be that this is exactly why pluralistic institutions are so important, because they can be seen as civilizing agents. Okay, so people may not like others, but they can't act on those aversions, and they must overcome their sort of natural proclivity to be suspicious of others who talk differently, look differently, believe other things, and so on. Now, I would add to that, if you have these pluralist institutions, they will actually feed back and affect tolerance, because people will internalize the norms, as Avner Greif and other people have argued for a long time. So the existence of institutions of this kind may end up in the end affecting what people believe. So here is the sort of the mother, of all pluralist institutions. This is the First Amendment of the Constitution, and I think it actually changed the way people think about others in some way. Now, just a brief digression here, and that is this kind of cultural pluralism all invariably desirable? So, you know, it's in principle, we should allow people to enjoy highly diverse and heterodox beliefs, even if others reject them wholeheartedly. So you think about paganism, maybe sexual behaviors, the wearing of religious attires, tattoos, various forms of eccentricity. Basically, as long as these do not create an externality, we should just have institutions in place that allow these things. But of course, there is this gray area. What do we do with people who believe in Holocaust denial, satanic worship, eugenicist doctrines, and things like that? So there's always sort of this gray areas. I would only add that unless there are externalities, you might well ask, what kind of harm is caused if people believe that the Earth is only 5,700 years old, or that dinosaurs coexisted with humans? And it is, I think, something we can all agree on, that even if 99.9% of all crackpot theories are just that, we can never be sure that some teeny tiny fraction of them may not have some kind of unsuspected value. But it should be added that these pluralist institutions are always and everywhere a second best outcome, because there is this sort of gray area between free speech and hate speech that all the newspapers are talking about. Okay. So now coming to the main question, is and was diversity good for the economy? So what I'm going to propose to you here, let me put this up as, okay, this is better. So what I'm going to propose to you here is a variation of what is known in the history of technology as Kranzberg's law. And so Mel Kranzberg has this sort of famous essay in which he has these laws of technology. And the first of these laws of technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So there you have Mel, that's Mel Kranzberg, and I've adapted that famous statement to the issue at hand, basically saying diversity is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And, needless to say, that first you see this, the question is, what the hell do you mean by that in the first place? Okay, and that's probably a fair question. So what I mean by this is that, much like technology, diversity has a substantial impact on outcomes, but the direction of the effect depends on other factors. And in the central proposition that I'm going to make is this: the net economic effects of diversity are mediated by institutions. And so if you were to think of this as sort of a regression that you're running, what would matter is not on the left-hand side, the outcome variable is more than anything else, the interaction term of institutions and diversity. So it's the impact of diversity depends on whether the institutions are good or bad. So in that sense, it's very much like natural resources, and this is this whole debate about natural resources. Are they a curse or are they a blessing? And the answer, of course, must be that it depends on the institutions. If you have a country with good institutions, like, say, Norway or Canada, then natural resources can be a blessing. If the institutions are bad, like in Russia or Equatorial Guinea, and you can make the list endlessly long, they may actually be a curse, and the resource curse may hold. So what evidence, then, is there? Let me see if I can get it. Yes, that diversity is economically beneficial. So I'm just going to go over very briefly over a very large literature, ladies and gentlemen, but time is. So the one question is about the micro or the firm level, and the other is about the macro or the economy level. So there's a whole bunch of literature here, and it's been around for almost 30 years. There was a survey made by Millikins and Martins in 96. The two sort of books that make the point most strikingly are Richard Florida's book On the Rise of the Creative Class and Scott Page and on how the power of diversity creates better groups. So you can look at that, and you sort of see the argument being made in great detail about how diversity stimulates creativity and so on, and brings new opinions to the table and things like that. Now the empirical work on that, and it's quite substantial in the management literature, but the finding seems to be very mixed. And one meta-analysis talks about how cultural diversity involves trade-off. So the optimal mix may depend on the specific task. And so I would say, having read, I don't know how many of these papers, it's very hard to actually come up with some kind of bottom line, it's good or bad. It's always, it depends on the task at hand. Maybe the best, I think, the insight that you get from this is there's sort of deep level diversity. These are unobservable characteristics, and surface level things like looks and dress and skin color and language and things like that. And that by and large, deep level diversity, so these are unobservable characteristics, are associated with more creativity, whereas surface level or phenotypical diversity, if you want, will raise identity threats, and then it tends to be on the whole negatively correlated with creativity. Most of the effects, by the way, as far as I can read the regression coefficients, aren't particularly large. So it's sort of hard to know, and it all sort of depends very much in the spirit of Malkranzberg's law. On the macro level, what we have is we've sort of adapted some of the diagrams that were made by the seminal paper by Alessina et al., which was in the Journal of Economic Growth, and the survey by Alessina and LaFerrara. These are all fairly old, but we updated them to modern data. And here are three diagrams. This is religious fractionalization, and as opposed to average growth of income in the last 40 years. And basically, you look at this diagram, and your first response is meh. The R square is like 4.1%. This doesn't look terribly impressive. Linguistic fractionalization is a little bit better, but not exactly great either. And by the way, the slope is negative. So, and finally, we have ethnic fractionalization. This is a well-known result. Here, it's actually somewhat larger. It's 16.2%. It's statistically significant, but again, it doesn't blow you away. The real question is, you need to know a lot more. But the short and long of it is that diversity explains very little of growth in the past 40 years. But insofar as any correlation, it's negative, and it's more pronounced for ethnic than for religious linguistics, as you might imagine. So then, of course, there is a fair amount of work on the sort of macro criterion on the likelihood of violence. There's sort of a classic paper by Jim Phelan and David Layden suggesting that it's not. And then, a bunch of papers came out criticizing that. And you can sort of look up this literature, and it seems that armed conflict, once you do it correctly, which is not so much diversity as polarization, you can get some kind of result. The only sort of result that I think is confirmed is, again, Kranzberg's law. Countries that have bad institutions, here's a list of them, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Rwanda, can make this as big as you want. Their diversity leads to violence. In those countries with good institutions, you think about Switzerland, you think about Belgium, you think about Finland, even the United States, if you want, it leads to a high economic performance. So let me turn to economic history now before I run out of my clock. So the example I want to focus on mostly is what happens when you have small ethnic or religious minorities in a large country. So you have an outgroup of a minority and an in-group, which is the large majority of population. And so we have many examples in economic history in which such minority were living in societies in which there was some kind of dominant majority, which was reasonably homogeneous. So the difference between the minority and the majority is well defined. So the examples that you have on the slide here are, of course, something we all know about. Jews, they're everywhere except in Israel, and then Roma and many places in Europe. Less well known, perhaps, as these German settlers in Russia and the Balkans, Muslims in many places, many European countries, Myanmar, or they used to be, and then in places like India, where they are a large majority. Of course, we have Armenian immigrants, but primarily in the Middle East, Chinese in Southeast Asia. I can make this list longer, but you get the idea, okay? Now, many of these people are what is known as service minorities. And these minorities, many of them would perform services which the majority did not or could not. And so many of these minorities were, specialized in trade, in financial services, in medicine, state management, and so on and so forth. And so they were obviously beneficial to the economy and, increased income. And yet, all the same, these minorities were often persecuted and expelled. One think about the Asians being kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin many years ago, and and on and on. So you can see that there are equilibria emerging, but they tend to be fragile, and so you might well ask, under what conditions would a service minority be tolerated by the majority? So here I am going to write down 6 conditions, and I borrow these from the work of Soumitra Jha at Stanford, who has a brilliant paper on the topic, or 2 actually. And I'm going to go very briefly through this list, but I think they're all making sort of a very intuitive sense. One is, of course, that just basic complementarity. So are minority and the majority groups complementary in some way? You want something like locked-in specialization. That's a very important condition. I'll come back to it later on. One group should not be able to replicate or seize and then successfully deploy the resources or competence of the other group. You want them, the outgroup, not to be so small or so successful that they can accumulate a huge wealth that can be confiscated. That you don't want a very large vulnerability gap in that one group is organized for violence and the other is not. It's very tempting for the majority to grab the assets of the minority. You want, this is I think an important thing. You want, if the minority is very successful, you want some kind of redistribution. You want them to sort of show, well, we made a lot of money living in majority, but here's some back. So they fund hospitals, museums, things. And finally, of course, you don't want the discount rate of the ruling class or the in-group to be too high, because if it is, then they will basically just say, well, the hell with the long run. We're going to confiscate this money now. And of course, that's happened especially with Jews in the Middle Ages in England and so on. Now, his example, Jha's example in his sort of classic paper, which was published, I think, in 2013, are Muslims in Indian port cities before the Raj. And it's actually a persistence paper, but the argument is that in those cities that were on the coast in India, the Hindus and Muslims had complementary skills that were not easily replicable, but were mutually beneficial. And so in those cities, the relationship between Hindus and Muslims was much better than elsewhere, and there were far fewer violent riots in the 19th and 20th century as a result of that. Now, similar arguments, of course, have been made about the Jews. For many centuries, the Jews possessed these skills and resources that a non-Jewish majority needed. I point you, of course, to the book by Maristella and Zwiga, published in 2012, which make this point. But if you look at the more recent Becker and Pascali paper, you see something quite similar there. It's about lending. There's a wonderful book by Yuri Slezkine, a Russian historian, who points out that anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe flared up in the second half of the 19th century, because at that point the skills that the Jews had in the service occupation could be more easily reproduced by non-Jews, and that actually broke up the equilibrium. Now, I want to point out that even if all of those conditions by Soumitra are satisfied, intolerance can still be driven by many factors outside economics, such as scapegoatism after some disaster, racist prejudices, religious fanaticism, and so on and so forth. So one of the serious threats to intergroup harmony is what I call, or what others call, political entrepreneurs who try to benefit politically from using homophily and prejudice against vulnerable minorities, even if those minorities are beneficial for the country. Okay, and so this is I want to point to this classic paper by Ed Glazer, published also 20 years ago. And basically what he points out, that populist demagogues will create fake news and false accusations in order to benefit their own careers. And such hate entrepreneurs can cause serious damage to a culture of tolerance and basically disrupt pluralist institutions. So here is one example of a classic hate entrepreneur. You may see it doesn't take much imagination to see this anti-Semitic cartoon. Here's the man responsible. This is Drummond. This is in 1880, and he basically made his money and his influence by bad mouthing and accusing this Jewish minority, which actually quite is Drummond. Here are his dates. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about diversity in European history and make the following point. The most striking part, I think, is not linguistic diversity, although that was quite, but religious diversity. And as you all know, in medieval Western Europe, the Latin Church, or the Catholic Church, as it became known later, had essentially a virtual monopoly, but it still was anti-pluralist. So it organized crusades against and the Inquisition against heretics and against Muslims and so on and so forth. I'll skip this slide just for purpose of time. But the natural historical experiment that we have is, of course, the Reformation. So the Reformation, I think, are a very good example of what happened when you have a fairly homogeneous society, which all of a sudden splits into two or more subgroups, which are very well differentiated. And what kind of economic consequences did these changes in cultural belief have? So the Protestant Reformation increased religious diversity. What were the economic effects? Well, for the first century and a half, I would say the institutions were sufficiently bad in the sense that they were driven by a culture of intolerance and bigotry, so that the net effect of diversity and economic growth were largely negative. So there's a recent paper by Matthias Cabello, which points out that that the Holy Inquisition and the Catholic Counter-Reformation weakened scientific growth, particularly in the southern Catholic parts of Europe. And it didn't do much good to the Protestants either. So both sides actually experienced a slowdown of scientific growth, although the Catholics suffered more. But clearly, the main consequence of the Reformation was violence. So here you have two examples. These are fairly closely apart. And on the left, you have the Spanish Fury in Antwerp in 1576, and on the right, you have the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that people know, everybody knows about. And things like that were all over Europe. The worst, of course, of all was the 30 Years' War of 1618. Now, it is true that at some point after 1650, the attitudes began to change, and with them, with a huge lag, the institutions. And so the idea of religious tolerance caught on in the 17th century, at least among some portions of the more educated classes. And, people have sort of shown this as to be a great example of growing progress. In fact, however, you look at it carefully and you see that it is by leaps and bounds with many setbacks, two steps forward, one step back. And that it certainly didn't mean full emancipation. It means at best peaceful coexistence and freedom of conscience. And so this is a wonderful book that describes this in great detail. This is his hero. This is a man called Sebastian Castello. In spite of his Italian-sounding name, he actually was very French. And it's the first one to actually point out that this is, an extremely costly and pointless conflict. And then slowly you see the Enlightenment in one form or another supporting the idea of religious tolerance. This is maybe the most famous example, but of course there are many others that we could. Now, one driver of pluralism, and this shows the ambiguity of how this is all work, is that everybody recognized that anti-pluralism, that's to say, institutions that suppressed some minority, were costly. And so in 1598, basically Catholic France guaranteed toleration to the Huguenots, and there was just a pragmatic decision by Henry IV. But in many cases, these rulers weren't maximizing their income, okay? And so in 1685, it was revoked with a huge cost to France. And what's more, even in the more countries that had more relatively more pluralist institutions, they were far from color, race, or religion. It's not really until 1829 that Britain passes the Tolerance Act, but there you have it. Now, I would say after 1815, much of Western Europe settles on the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. Slowly, you see Western European nations adopted more tolerant attitudes, and hence they start, bringing about more pluralist institutions, and then, of course, benefited from these in multiple ways. The interesting thing, actually, in Eastern Europe, it's exactly the other direction. So the Pale of Settlement for Jews in Russia is established in 1791, almost exactly at the time when France was emancipating its Jews. And so this is another part of sort of divergence of East and West. But once you start moving into this later 17th century, you start seeing some of the positive effects of competition between different religions and the sort of complementarities between them. So one of the ideas that emerges at this time, that instead of persecuting and executing heretics, what you want to do is educate their youngsters in the true faith. Okay, so the best and most famous example of that is the first Jesuit schools. But you also have in Britain dissenting academies, and there's a recent paper published by two of my students on showing that the number of American colleges in the 19th century grew very rapidly, far larger than there would have been otherwise, because of religious diversity. So each sect and each sort of group wanted to have its own university, and that, of course, meant far more choices in the universities. So let me very briefly go over, sort of, if I have time, 4 pragmatic case studies of the importance of minorities and why pluralist institutions really were beneficial here. So the standard story, of course, is Britain. As I said, it was not anticipated, but the act of toleration allowed people to stay in Britain under certain conditions, which were quite discriminatory. For instance, dissenters and Catholics were excluded from government service in the military, which meant that their energies and talents were, of course, diverted to economic activities, which meant that they played a much larger role in the Industrial Revolution. Louis XIV kicking out the Huguenots illustrates the consequences, because many of these were some of the best and the brightest of French citizens, and many of them ended up in England, including, of course, the famous Denis Papin, who could rightly claim to be the real inventor of the steam engine, and then the creme de la creme of the French clock and watchmaking industry, and on, which had major externalities for the Industrial Revolution. And so the famous paragraph by Voltaire, who is a great admirer of England, and he writes in 1733, this statement, somewhat exaggerated, I should say, in which he says, the Jew, the Mohammedan, and the Christian negotiate with one another as if they were all of the same religion. The only heretics are those who declare bankruptcy. Well, maybe it sounds better than it really was. But what is true is that dissenters punched way above their weight in the Industrial Revolution. They supplied a disproportionate large number of leading industrialists. Some estimates around 50%. It's a little bit lower, but it's still pretty good. We have some key examples, the Quakers, for instance, who in Birmingham, for instance, where 1/3 of the iron masters and tanners, also they were only 1% of the town's population. Of course, Unitarians who are also dissenters because they denied the Holy Trinity, provided people like James Watt and Josiah Wedgwood, that everybody knows, as well as people like, just say, Joseph Priestley, and so on, not to mention Newton himself, who was sort of a closet Unitarian. And so clearly having these minorities around and tolerating them was a good thing for Britain. The Netherlands, so clearly it is sort of widely recognized to be the pioneer of European capitalism, which whatever you think European capitalism really is. And, it's been widely argued that it's basically pluralist by instinct. Now, on the books, there are many discriminatory laws because these are, the people in power. Many of them were bigoted Calvinists. But de facto informal norms, and the evidence for that is quite striking, are far more pluralist than formal ordinances. So authorities more often than not, turn a blind eye to violations of anti-pluralist law. So here is a famous document that describes the Netherlands as part of the. He actually arrived. The author actually arrived. It was actually Swiss. From Geneva, I believe. His name escapes me at the moment. It should be on this slide, but it isn't. But he points out, this is, you can read the translation here. So this is what he found in the Netherlands. Beside those of the Reformed Calvinist Church, we find, all these people, some of them I'm not entirely sure how big these numbers were, but it's all sort of weird sects of Protestants. And then he says, not to mention Jews, Turks, and Persians, in regards that they were not even Christians. So he doesn't count them, but they obviously were all tolerated in the Netherlands. Here is actually a real telling example how under Dutch capitalism money talks louder than bigotry. So this is about a guy called Peter Stuyvesant, who was a very bigoted and sort of fanatical Calvinist, was Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, which later, of course, became New York. And so a bunch of Jews showed up there because they had fled parts of where Portuguese Inquisition was after them, and they settled in New Amsterdam. And he didn't like them either, so he wrote back to the West India Company asking for permission to kick out the Jews. And they wrote back that such a request would be unreasonable and unfair because the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others. And so that's, I think, a way in which, modern capitalism may conflict with a lack of pluralism. But I think there's something else about the Dutch Republic which I want to point out because I think it's central to understanding. In the Golden Age, the Dutch Republic was sort of a loose confederacy of 7 basically self-governing provinces that ran their own affair. And within each province, you still have cities that do their own thing as well. And so you have a very high fragmentation of political power. And what that really means, I think, is that minorities also always have an opportunity to sort themselves into places where they are more welcome. And I think there's a deeper lesson there because Europe as a whole, as I have, pointed out many times, is decentralized and polycentric. And in that kind of system, it's always more likely to be more pluralist and diverse, simply because the bigoted and prejudiced people, suffer from coordination failure, and they can't quite get the act together. So there's always places where people can go. Now, if you have powerful autocrats, I say like Louis XIV or Alexander III or Ferdinand Isabella, they can carry out major acts of intolerance. In the Netherlands, anybody like that would not succeed simply because the Jews would just pack up and move 20 miles to the north or to the south or to the east. And that's exactly the point. Now, let me say something about Germany. This is a little bit later, but it's probably fair to say that both Imperial and Weimar Germany were fairly pluralist on paper. These Protestants, Catholics, and Jews had all equal rights. They voted, they had access to everything. And the formal institutions of Imperial Germany rarely discriminated against Catholics, except for a brief period of the Kulturkampf. Now, anti-Semitism, of course, is alive and well, but the institutions, the formal institutions, were actually reasonably pluralist. And the net result, of course, is that this was a major contribution to the economy and the culture of Imperial and Weimar Germany. So some of these Jews are very famous here. Two most famous ones: Gerson von Bleichroeder, the banker who basically financed Bismarck's war. This is Fritz Haber, the inventor of the nitrogen fixing process, but the list can be made much longer. These are entrepreneurs, these are industrialists, various people who played a major role in the economic and I would say cultural growth of Imperial Germany. But they violated one of the rules that Jaap points out, and that is that they increasingly compete with rather than complement successful Germans. Okay, so for every Emil Rathenau, there is a Siemens and a group, and for every Tietz and Wernheim who own these big department stores, there were non-Jewish store owners like Karstadt. If you look at science, okay, so obviously the most successful scientist in Germany in the 1920s was Albert Einstein, but his success spurred the wrath and jealousy of non-Jewish competitors. There's this famous case of this physicist Philip Leonard, who is the one who dubbed Einstein's work as Jewish physics and later became one of the big honchos in Nazi science in the 1930s. And I think that violates conditions, and it makes it more understandable why, despite their enormous contribution in Germany, of course, the institutions changed dramatically in 1933. And as we all know, the cost of following these policies was extremely costly, as Fabian Woldinger has shown. German science and medicine paid a heavy price in losing its Jews, not only in the 1930s, but this was a persistent effect. So in that sense, you can sort of see why, if that condition by Soumitra Jazz doesn't hold, then perhaps the equilibrium becomes even less stable. Finally, let me say something about a small group, which is the Parsi population of India. Now, I don't mean put India, certainly not today, as an example of pluralist institutions, but the Parsi are sort of an interesting case because they're a very small group. I think there's about 60,000 of them in all of India. They are actually Zoroastrians. They're neither Hindu nor Muslims, and they settled in Northwest India after the Muslim conquest of Persia, reputedly in the 8th or 9th century, and they were, this is a mistake, should be Northwest India. So the only condition was that they should learn the language and follow local marriage customs. And so they were this sort of small group, mostly in Gujarat. And then as the Europeans start showing up in India, they become very successful. So this is the first one. This is Rustam Manek, who famously not only dealt with the British, but he actually went to London to sue another Englishman and won. And, if you look at the last 150 years, these are names that certainly lots of people will know. You think about the great conductor Zubin Mehta, who's part of this group. But the sort of father of Indian industry, Jamsetji Tata, still the Tata firm is still, of course, one of the larger industrial project firms in the world. And in fact, equally prominent, this guy, Sir Dinshaw Petit, these are his dates, basically the pioneer of the modern textile industry in India, which, as we know, started to take off in the 1880s and 1890s. Various intellectuals, in fact, two intellectuals, believe it or not, both named Homi Bhabha, they're unrelated. One of them is the leading nuclear physicist and the father of the Indian nuclear bomb, and the other is an influential critical theorist at Harvard. So, I mean, this is clearly a society and a group that contributes mightily to the Indian society. Now, just to sort of summarize this, let me see, where was I? None of this suggests that diversity is a necessary condition for economic success, and I wouldn't argue this. We know of many successful economies that show very little diversity. Think about South Korea, you think about Japan, you think about the Scandinavian countries, at least until recently. And others, like Israel, like Singapore, like Switzerland, are diverse in one dimension and another, and are very economically very successful. So I would say that on the basis of either economic history or contemporary experience, it remains sort of hard to argue that diversity is a necessary or a major factor in any aspect of economic performance. But of course, what we also are interested in is just the direction of the partial derivative. And here, as I said, if you leave out pluralist institutions, you really aren't going to get anything. You must look at the institutions. And the great challenge for future research is to try to understand why some countries have better institutions than others in this regard, and why they sometimes change dramatically, as they did, for instance, in Germany in 1933. But I think without differentiating between tolerance, which is a set of beliefs, and pluralism, which is a set of institutions, we're not going to understand exactly how this works. And of course, the big challenge is to ask the question, how do institutions and culture affect one another? Which, of course, I'm not going to deal with here. All right, and that's basically it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel, for a fascinating presentation. Lots of things to think about since we had this unfortunate technical issue in the beginning of the seminar. So we changed kind of the customary 20-minute discussion, and we'll hold it from now and go on till 6:15 with the extra time. So without further ado, so I'll start with the questions, but please put your questions in the Q&A, and I will moderate them to Joel. And again, for those that have to leave at 6, because that was the official time of ending the seminar, we thank you for participating, and invite you for next week's talk, which will happen next week, unlike the usual 2-week difference. So we'll have our presentation next week on the end of the Polish hyperinflation in the 20s. So please join us next week at the same time. And now we'll turn to the Q&A. So I have Robin McCauley asking whether a lack of diversity makes financial bubbles and subsequent financial crisis more likely. What's your opinion on that?
Oh God, I must admit, I never thought about it in context of financial bubbles. And the one thing I guess I could is that much of the German banking industry, of course, was controlled by Jewish bankers, particularly both in the imperial and to a somewhat smaller extent in the Weimar Republic, and that as long as the banking system works fine, this is at least by most people acceptable. Once the banking system starts to fail, you need a scapegoat. And as I mentioned, scapegoatism against some minority is an easy way for political entrepreneurs to make their mark. And we do know that when the German banking system gets into a serious trouble in the 1930s, that people blamed the Jews, and that this was sort of a grist to the mill of anti-Semitic politicians who used that. But I'm not sure I can say that there's no any evidence that being more diverse would lead to financial instability in the sense of sort of high frequency fluctuations. What is clearly true, and this has been shown, all the way from for the last 25 years in sort of Maristella Botticini's famous paper on Jewish moneylenders, is that minorities often bear, much of the financial sector. Okay, and part of the reason, of course, is that certainly in the Christian world there is there's sort of these usury laws, and the same is true a fortiori in the Muslim world, and so Jews would play a major role in there. But in fact, we see these service minorities supporting the financial system in many other places, like in Southeast Asia, for instance, by Chinese migrants. I don't think that that would make the system necessarily more fragile, except insofar that, a more sophisticated and developed financial system is inherently subject to fragility than a world in which capital markets are highly underdeveloped. But that's hardly an advantage.
Thank you. So I have a question from Paul Rody, who tackles the issue from a different dimension. So he's actually asking about minorities that actually are elites and dominate other people. For instance, the case of British West Indies, where a minority exploits the large in-group, which is maybe a little bit different from what your main story was about, weak minorities within or small and weak minorities.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, he's right about that. There are many places in which the dominant group may not necessarily be the largest group, and I don't think that actually changes much of the story. He's right about the West Indies. I could add other examples, for instance, like the role of Manchu people in Qing China, for instance, is another example, and I think that's in a way that doesn't really matter all that much, except of course that in those cases you are more likely to see the minority, the dominant minority, being turned out by the majority when it turns against them. But otherwise, I think that in and of itself doesn't make much of a difference. It's an interesting and I say more or less exceptional kind of situation. In most cases, particularly look at the history of the Jews or the Farsis or people like that, they would tend to be a smaller group, or say the Huguenots in France, groups like that. I mean, diversity. I didn't get into the question, how big these groups are supposed to be. Size, however, I would add that size matters, and so it was perhaps easier for the Hindus to be tolerant of the Farsi than they were of the Muslims, because there are so far more Muslims that in some sense may have been seen as some kind of a threat. But that too, I don't think easily generalizes. So again, that's my first answer. I haven't really thought about that, Paul. So I'm, but it's a good point.
We have another question from Simone Veig about. She thanks you for your talk, and ask whether you can comment more on the long run effects for the Spanish economy of the Inquisition that started in the late 15th century, and what might the work of Ross say about what was begun by Ferdinand Isabella?
Well, there is a very detailed and large project by Joachim Ross and Mauricio Derigman, trying to tease out the effect of the Inquisition, and I'm trying to see to what extent there's sort of this kind of in this sort of cross-sectional way, whether the severity of the Inquisition led to slower economic development. And they find it does make a difference, but I must say, the size of the effect does not blow me away, and it doesn't blow them away either, I think it's probably fair to say. I do think that, as I said earlier, the religious tolerance or lack of it was costly to Spain, and I think maybe it's not so much the Inquisition. The Inquisition is just one institution, but basically, of course, what happened was that Spain in much of its post 16th century history is essentially free of Jews, and but it's not free of religious intolerance altogether. And so what Cabello has shown is that, for instance, give you one example where religious intolerance made a big difference. One of the things the Spanish did, and Matias shows that, is that they prohibited Spanish students from studying overseas. So you couldn't go anymore and study in Protestant countries, which they were doing before. So he shows that, he's got the data on these students moving overseas. And on the whole, the quality of Spanish university and Spanish science declines very sharply. And he attributes that, I think, quite convincingly in that paper, which I recommend to everybody. It's a really cool paper, to the lack of religious tolerance. And certainly kicking out the Jews was costly to them and costly to the Portuguese as well. And so in that sense, I think you should look at sort of a somewhat larger picture as, as describing Spain as sort of an, a paradigmatic example of a country that paid a high cost of religious intolerance. Countries like France, fluctuates much more. So you get one, 14s who kicks out the Huguenots in 1685, but then in the 18th century, many of them are coming back. They don't advertise it, they don't make a big deal of them, but we see them coming back. Not all of them, but quite a few. So France sort of fluctuates back and forth between pluralism and the lack of pluralism. Spain does not. It takes them a very long time until they finally sort of rid themselves of this sort of reactionary attitude of the Catholic Church. And so I think in that sense, it's a very good example. It does have bad actions, and in this particular case, it really eventually leads to some religious homogenization of the population, which I think was costly to Spain. So I think it sort of makes the point. Now, in other countries where we see sort of a mixture of Protestants and Catholic, like Switzerland, like the Netherlands, and above all, of course, in Germany, as long as the institutions are good, it actually turns out to be an advantage. More questions?
Nathan, you're muted.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Nathan, you're muted.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I'm on. John Fonseca is asking, does tolerance and pluralism have a sort of a life cycle? Is that something that is cyclical, or is that a trend?
I hope not. I mean, this is a question I'm asking myself all the time. 20 years ago, I would have said, no, this is cyclical. Finally, we have discovered that the Enlightenment philosopher had it right, and that we really should listen to, John Locke and Denis Diderot and these people basically telling us, let 100 flowers bloom. Living in the United States for the last 10 years, I'm becoming less sure of that every day, and I'm looking at, and the same would be true for Europe. But exactly because of that, I think it is so important to have pluralist institutions and essentially enshrine them in a constitution that is very hard to change. And I think that has been part of the saving graces of America, despite the deplorable condition of its current politics. But at least things like the First Amendment, and hopefully what remains of the separation of church and state. I think these things have affected the way people think about it, and there may be setbacks, but I think in the long term, the trend, at least in the West, is hopefully toward greater tolerance, and therefore to greater pluralism. But I must say, I think like that, like on good days. Every Monday and Thursday I have a bad day, and then I scratch my head, and I'm not totally sure whether 100 years from now we may not be living back in the 17th century in some dimensions. I mean, it's sort of hard to remain an institutional optimist in 2024.
Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. So I'll maybe throw 2 questions at you, and you answer them and allocate the time proportionately. We have more, but it's yeah, we're running late. So one question from Daisy Rana is asking whether the effect of diversity is on economic growth is non-linear, in the sense that it's, if you interacted with high or low diversity, that creates an impact, while in the middle it's kind of not that important. So is it non-linear? A question from Dro Goldberg asking whether religious intolerance in England during the Pilgrims settlement of New England was actually in the long run beneficial for England in some kind of a weird indirect way. So by sending them to
the question about non-linearity sort of reminds me a little bit of this paper by which is about genetic, not so much diversity, by Oded Gallo and Ashraf. And basically they claim for this sort of, you know, inverse U-shaped thing in which very high diversity is bad for you because people attack each other, and very low diversity is bad for you because there's not enough creativity. You're sort of supposed to be somewhere in the middle. I mean, I think that model is probably more applicable to acquired characteristics like religion and ideology than it is to genetic diversity, which is what Oded and his co-author argue. I find that paper has been, I think, severely attacked by people who know, not just by people like in sociology and political science, but also by geneticists. So I think the last word has not been said about it, and it's a discussion worth having. But I am not sure that there is a sort of some kind of a non-linear relationship. You look at countries that are completely non-diverse. I mean, take Iceland, say, they've been, quite successful about this. Some other countries are highly diverse, like the United States. And, despite everything, certainly economically, it's a successful. I must say, without telling me more, without telling me more about the institutions of the country, I cannot predict anything about how good or how bad diversity is going to be. That's sort of the upshot of my talk, and I'm getting to be more convinced as I, think more about it. Dro's point is quite clever. But I'm not sure that I would, venture into a greater analysis of what the roots of American pluralism really are. There is this famous argument about these sort of 4 waves of people who came to the sort of northern 13 colonies, of which the Pilgrims or the Puritans were by far, of course, the least tolerant. But you have to remember that after the Pilgrims came the Quakers, and William Penn, who was one of the first people to actually establish pluralist institutions in the colonies under his rule. And then you get people going to the south, the Scottish Irish, and so on and so forth. So I would say any sort of simple explanation of why America has turned out to be this committed to pluralism would probably be something that would take a lot of study. I would only add maybe this point, and that is that the one thing that really mattered to the formation of the pluralist institution was that the people who led the rebellion and then the writing of the constitutions in 1787 planning the amendments of 1789, these people were heavily influenced by European enlightened writing. And that I think is something that's often that we sort of look at what did these immigrants bring. That's the sort of Acemoglu Robinson approach. And my argument is that not only they brought a lot, what they brought with them is the ability to read books that, that were written mostly in Europe and that influenced the people who set up the institutions. And then not only that they set them up in a pluralist way, but they set up the rules. It's very difficult to change the rules, and I think matters a great deal. But you have to remember, that England too, after 1689, commits to somewhat lesser degree to this level of tolerance in which people are allowed to stay. And never forget that the person who allowed Jews to come back to England was Oliver Cromwell, not otherwise known as a tolerant and sort of enlightened man, but he is in 1665 basically said, yeah, well, Jews can come back to England. So I think there was probably something in England in which I think, in which they were looking at the Dutch, and of course in 1688 you got a loss of influence on the Dutch. It was the Glorious Revolution that said, we should adopt these sort of more open-minded and tolerant attitudes toward our pluralist institutions. And I think that's, in some sense, that stuff, I think, eventually spilled over to the northern colonists, whether the colonists knew it or not.
Okay, so we actually exceeded our allotted time, and we really thank you for being with us, and it was a fascinating discussion.
Right.
I think a lot of people remained till the last minute, so I think you...
That's a good sign. So here's one more announcement. Anybody, I have a paper with footnotes and with details, on which this talk is based. Anybody who wants a copy of that paper just needs to write me an email, and you will get it back in. It's not fully finished. It still needs one more revision before I send it off, but it's basically I think organized this talk with a lot more detail.
Okay, so with that we formally end. Thank you very much.
All right.
See you everybody next week.
Stay safe, everybody, and hope for good news.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.